Judge Reginald Hayes was a symbol of fairness in Greensboro, North Carolina. A man devoted to his ideals, he ruled based on reason and justice, regardless of outside pressure or influence. But on that fateful night, he found himself a victim of a system he had once believed in. That evening, the city was quiet, a rare peace that Reginald cherished after his stressful hours in the courtroom. As his car glided down Main Street, a sense of relief crept into his mind. He was almost home, where he could leave the burdens of the day behind him. But the moment did not last. Suddenly, red and blue lights flashed behind him, breaking the silence. Reginald could feel his heart rate increase. A police cruiser was following him, like a predator stalking its prey. He slowed down, pulling slowly to the side of the road, conscious of his every move. But even as he complied, the lights in his rearview mirror cast flickering shadows on his face, shadows of suspicion. The officer stepped out of the patrol car, tall and broad-shouldered, his face cold and unfriendly. His nameplate read, Simmons. No greeting, no courtesy, just a curt command, driver's license and registration. Reginald was no stranger to such encounters. He had seen too many cases of police abuse. But now, as he found himself on the receiving end of injustice, he felt the humiliation. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because his very existence was being called into question simply because of his appearance. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm as he took out his papers. But the disrespect in Simmons's demeanor made him feel something deeper. This was more than just a routine examination. This was a reminder that even a respected judge could be treated like a suspect simply because of the color of his skin. That moment of injustice not only wounded his pride, but also stirred up a storm in his mind. He began to wonder, if even someone of his status was treated like that, what about those without power? How many injustices had innocent families, ordinary people suffered at the hands of those who abused their power? Those thoughts led him to an investigation he had never anticipated. As he dug deeper, layer after layer of truth was peeled away, revealing a dark web of corruption. The police aren't just abusing their power, they're using their power to forcibly take over the homes of vulnerable families, turning people's desperation into profit for the powerful. Reginald knows he can't take on this force alone. But he's not alone. A trusted friend, a fearless journalist, joins him in bringing the truth to light. What they find is not only shocking, but has the power to shake the city. Greensboro, once a quiet community, is forced to confront its dirty secrets. Those in power tremble at the exposure. Families who have been dispossessed stand up to demand justice. And two men, a judge and a journalist, are determined to risk it all to bring justice back to their community. This isn't just Reginald Hayes' story. This is a fight for the truth. And he knows there's no turning back. Reginald slowly reached into his glove compartment, each movement executed with the calm, clarity he had perfected over years of litigation in court. He did not rush, did not hesitate, knowing that his smallest actions could be misinterpreted. "Here is my identification," he said, his voice calm but with a dry edge that even he recognized. He handed over his papers, his documents, his legal status, a tangible proof of who he was, of his reputation, and the career he had built. He hoped this would clear things up quickly. But Officer Simmons did not even glance at him. Instead, his gaze returned to the Lexus, and he muttered, as if to himself. "Luxury car." He raised his head, his eyes narrowed, searching. "What is a guy like you doing in a car like this, around here?" The question was implied. One that Reginald couldn't help but understand. A wave of hot anger rose inside him, but he held it back. He'd been in these situations before. He knew that letting his emotions take over would only make things worse. "I live here." His voice was still calm, but now it was sharper. Simmons sneered, as if the answer were a joke. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his hand going to his gun holster, an unnecessary but meaningful gesture. Reginald's mind was racing. His entire career had been built on the principle of justice, on the belief that truth and integrity would protect him. But now, stripped of his power, treated with suspicion for his mere presence, he felt exposed in a way he had never felt before. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that these were the moments when restraint mattered most. He opened the car door and stepped out. The atmosphere in the quiet neighborhood suddenly became visibly tense. A few faces appeared behind the windows, looking down at the scene with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Simmons began to search his car, each movement slow and deliberate, as if he wanted Reginald to feel every inch of the surveillance, the suspicion he was imposing. His expression hardened, but he could not completely hide the bias that lay beneath. Finally, after what felt like an age, Simmons straightened up, muttering, "That's right." He threw the ID back at Reginald without a trace of respect. Reginald caught it, and for a moment just stood there, staring at him. It was humiliating. But he held his ground, not bowing, not looking away. Words were useless now. And he knew it. So, with a curt nod, Reginald got back in his car and drove away. But as he headed down the street, his heart was pounding harder than usual. His mind was buzzing, his thoughts swirling, heavy as a boulder that couldn't be lifted. Anger welled up in his chest, but there was also a lingering sadness. This wasn't just about him. He knew it was bigger than that, a system that had been in place for too long, a machine that needed to change. The next day, Reginald sat silently in his office, staring blankly through the glass. The memories of the night's encounter were still seared into his mind, like a cut that wouldn't heal. He had spent his career believing in justice, working within a system that he thought protected everyone. But now, doubts crept in, eating away at that belief bit by bit. The office door swung open, pulling him out of his thoughts. Brian Lewis walked in, his eyes filled with worry, his shoulders tense as if he were carrying an invisible burden. "Reg, I heard about last night," Brian said, his voice low but troubled. He sat down in the chair across from Reginald, his hands clasped together on Reginald's desk. "Officer Simmons, he's not an isolated case. I've heard about him before. Complaints from people in the neighborhood, but no one really did anything about it." Reginald sighed, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "I didn't do anything wrong, Brian. I was just on my way home. And I'm being treated like a criminal. This isn't just one bad cop. It's part of something bigger." Brian nodded slowly, as if weighing Reginald's words. "I know. I saw it too," Brian said, pulling a file from his pocket. "There are reports, reg statistics of a group of people being targeted, stopped without cause, given stiffer tickets, even arrested. And one name keeps popping up in these reports, Prime Builders." Reginald's chest tightened. Prime Builders was not a name he was unfamiliar with. He'd seen it in property disputes, suspicious evictions. A company that quietly bought up land at low prices, then redeveloped it for those who could afford it, and evicted those who couldn't keep up. He looked at Brian, the seriousness in his eyes deeper than ever. "You're saying the police targeted these people, to make way for Prime Builders?" Brian didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the file, flipping through the pages. "The evidence is still weak," he said quietly. "But I think we need to find out more. If this is true, then we have a much bigger problem than a corrupt cop." Reginald nodded, his helplessness turning to determination. Last night he had been the victim. But today, he could do something. "I won't let this go." Reginald looked at Brian, his eyes flashing with suspicion. "Are you saying this is more than just harassment?" Brian leaned forward, his voice strained. "I think it's time we dig deeper. But this isn't something we can just bring to the chief and expect change. We need proof, hard evidence. Names, dates, everything that no one can ignore." A determination flared inside Reginald. This was the moment he'd been unconsciously waiting for. The humiliation from last night was no longer a mere wound but fuel for something bigger. Not just exposing Officer Simmons, but anyone else hiding behind a badge or a company name, using their power to oppress and exploit others. Reginald clenched his fists, his eyes sharpening. "Okay, Brian," he said, his voice calm but powerful. "We'll do whatever it takes." They quickly formulated a plan. Over the next few weeks, they would quietly gather records, starting with police reports related to major developers in the area. Brian would approach officers he trusted, finding out if anyone had noticed unusual patterns. Meanwhile, Reginald would dig into past lawsuits, cross-checking complaints against Simmons with dates and locations of incidents. No small clue would be overlooked. They both knew they were treading a dangerous line. But the path ahead was clear. This was more than just exposing a corrupt officer. This was exposing a web of crime that ran deep into the very fabric of the town they'd called home for years. The next weeks passed in a relentless rush. Reginald and Brian pieced together the disparate pieces, piece by piece, a disturbing picture. The isolated complaints about Simmons, the suspicious traffic stops, gradually revealed themselves as part of a much larger conspiracy. Reginald spent sleepless nights, poring over dozens of legal documents. Each case revealed a new layer of influence by the master builders. A pattern emerged: properties were being bought at suspiciously low prices, mostly from residents who had just faced an unexpected event, an arrest, an unexplained citation, or even subtle threats to leave. The pieces began to fit together, painting a picture of a systematic campaign to profit from the most vulnerable. Brian also gathered crucial information from officers in the field. Some had long suspected but never had enough evidence to speak up. As their data came together, an undeniable truth emerged: the corruption extended beyond Simmons to the upper echelons of power in the town. "We're not dealing with just one man," Brian said one evening, as they reviewed all the evidence they'd gathered. "We're dealing with a whole system." Reginald nodded. "Then we're going to bring that system down." In any case, prime builders swooped in, taking advantage of the chaos to make dubious deals. While rescue teams were still trying to help struggling residents, an offer to buy the property was made, so quickly that no one had time to react. Before the eviction could take place, the owners were forced to sign opaque, unfavorable contracts. But the rescue wasn't free; they were forced to leave, with no other choice. Soon, new construction projects sprang up, transforming homes that had once been shelters for families into profitable commercial buildings. Meanwhile, Brian's investigation into the police department yielded shocking results. He confided in officers he trusted, knowing that many of them were under pressure to target specific neighborhoods. "There was talk around the police station," one officer confided. "We were told to look for suspicious activity, but it was always the same people. And every time someone mentioned prime builders, we were told to move on." The dots began to connect. Reginald and Brian discovered that prime builders had powerful allies, not only in the police department but also in local government. Officials were allegedly bribed to turn a blind eye to serious violations, while police deliberately pressured residents into feeling they had no choice but to sell their properties for less than their true value. Unexplained irregularities in fines were gradually revealed. Some residents received unreasonable fines, the amount of which skyrocketed for no apparent reason, forcing them into a corner. Any complaints were brushed aside, as if there was a hidden force controlling everything. Late one night, Brian showed up at Reginald's office, carrying a thick stack of papers. His face was tense, his eyes filled with worry. "This is all I can get without raising suspicion," he said, placing the papers on the desk. Reginald flipped through the files, emails between officers and prime builders executives, payment records, hastily signed eviction orders. He frowned, his voice dropping. "This is worse than I imagined. They're not just pushing people out, they're doing it systematically. This isn't law enforcement. This is organized crime." Brian clenched his fists. "Exactly. And that's why we need to act now." Reginald stood by the window, his cold gaze scanning the quiet street. The strange cars were still parked there. They didn't move, but he knew they were watching. Every night, their presence was a silent warning. "The more we explore, the more we risk," Brian said quietly, his voice thoughtful. He leaned against the desk, clutching a file that held undeniable truths. Reginald felt a cold resolve wash over him. He had devoted his life to the law, believing in justice. But now he stood on the edge, a line between belief and bitter reality. He could look away, ignore it all, or go forward, facing the dangers that lurked. And he knew he had no choice. "We're going to go public," Reginald said, his voice firm, without a trace of hesitation. "We'll gather the last bit of evidence and make it impossible to ignore. The system manipulators, the corrupt officials, they can't continue in the shadows. This ends now." Brian nodded, his teeth clenched. They would bring the truth to the public, shine a light on the corruption that lay hidden in plain sight. As they left the office that night, the cold wind whipped at their faces, but neither of them backed down. The weight of the task weighed heavily on them, but they knew there was no turning back. When the day finally came, Reginald and Brian were ready. They had everything: email records, payment vouchers, testimonies from affected citizens, and even a few brave officers who had come forward to testify. Every piece of the puzzle led to the same thing: the shadowy manipulators who had turned justice into a farce. They decided to contact a local television station that had a reputation for investigative journalism. A live broadcast would ensure the story would not be buried. The truth would be revealed before millions of eyes. That evening, the tension in the studio was suffocating. Reginald sat in the green room, the dim fluorescent lights reflecting off his stoic face. Brian faced him, his eyes still glued to the files, going over every last detail. Neither of them said much, but the quiet determination between them said it all. When they were called into the studio, a wave of anxiety washed over Reginald. But then he took a deep breath, steadying himself. He remembered all the faces he had seen in the trials, the victims, the people the system had crushed. They couldn't fail. Not now. The lights flashed. The cameras began rolling. Now was the time to tell the truth. Reginald looked at every family affected by the scheme. They weren't just names on a list or addresses on a map, they were real people, with hopes, with memories embedded in the walls of their homes. They were the reason he was here tonight. The host stepped forward, her eyes serious as she spoke. "We're here tonight with Judge Reginald Hayes and Detective Brian Lewis, who have uncovered a disturbing web of corruption in our city." The air in the room grew tense as she continued, her voice slow but heavy. "Judge Hayes, can you tell us how this all began?" Reginald leaned forward, his hands clasped together as he weighed his words. "This investigation began with what seemed like isolated incidents," he explained, his gaze scanning the audience with a cold gaze. "But as we dug deeper, it became clear that this was no coincidence. A number of people, particularly from vulnerable communities, had been targeted by police with fines and other forms of intimidation. And each time, their homes ended up in the hands of big developers." He paused, taking a deep breath, as if trying to swallow the anger boiling inside him. This wasn't just harassment. This was an organized effort, a ruthless, carefully calculated plot. The camera panned to Brian, who was holding a thick file in his hands. Without waiting, he opened it, holding up several pages for the camera. "We have evidence," he said, his voice low but firm. "This is an email exchange between executives at Prime Builders and some high-ranking officials. Money is being transferred in exchange for influence, forcing the police to target certain areas, while turning a blind eye to other crimes." He paused, his eyes scanning the hushed crowd. "This system is designed to take people's homes and turn them into profits for a small group of greedy people." The studio was silent. No one said a word, but the air was heavy, as if everyone was burdened with an undeniable truth. The host clasped her hands on the table, her voice almost shaking as she asked, "Are you saying that developers have been working with certain officials to target specific neighborhoods, just to buy up properties for development projects?" Reginald looked straight into the camera. "That's exactly what we're saying," he confirmed. "And these are not just dry numbers on a page. These are families, people whose lives have been torn apart by the bottomless greed of a small group of powerful people. Those who believed in the system thought it would protect them. They never imagined that one day the system would turn against them. "We have evidence of harassment," Brian said, his voice thick with anger. "False arrests, ridiculous fines for minor offenses. It's all part of a plan to push them out of their homes." He paused, looked directly into the camera, and added, "There are good officers in our department who have tried to speak out. But they've been silenced, threatened, even pushed out of the force. This isn't just a matter of a few bad cops or greedy developers. This is a systemic failure." The host said nothing, letting the silence emphasize the weight of their words. Finally, she asked softly, her voice almost choking, "What do you hope will come of this?" Reginald looked at her, his gaze firm but sympathetic. "Justice for all those who have been hurt. Accountability for every official involved. And a reminder that no one is above the law, not even those who enforce it." The broadcast ended, but its impact was immediate. The phones at the TV station rang off the hook. Viewers were shocked, outraged by the revelations. News of the scandal spread quickly, sparking protests and powerful calls for action. The next day, the city was filled with protesters. They stood in front of City Hall, in front of police headquarters, demanding justice. City officials were under unprecedented pressure. Reginald and Brian had done the unthinkable, they had exposed a corrupt system. But they both knew the fight was far from over. They had touched a sensitive nerve. Those with vested interests in the system would not back down easily. And the days that followed were a whirlwind. Reginald and Brian were at the center of the chaos. The calls were relentless, support from the community, requests for interviews from the national media, and anonymous threats. "Be careful," one text warned them. Despite the tension, the public response offered new hope. Crowds gathered in front of City Hall, holding signs that read, "Our homes, our rights." Affected families spoke out about their stories, unjustified evictions, police brutality. Each word, each tear, sparked a wave of righteous anger. Reginald watched the scene on the evening news. His heart beat fast, not only with anxiety but also with the belief that, this time, the truth would not be buried. Because of the large number of people affected, city officials reacted quickly, placing several officers on leave, including Officer Simmons, and announcing a full investigation into prime builders. It was a victory, but Reginald and Brian knew it was only the beginning. Real change would take time, and the threat of retaliation loomed. Despite their vindication, Reginald could not fully celebrate. A heavy feeling clung to him, thinking of those who had suffered for so long without justice. The voices that had been ignored, the lives that had been ruined. The joy of victory was mixed with deep sadness. One evening, Reginald returned home to find his wife, Evelyn, waiting for him, her face solemn. She held a small envelope, her face tight with worry. "This was left on our doorstep," she said softly, handing him the envelope. Inside, Reginald found a piece of paper with a simple message. "Back off or there will be consequences." He felt a chill run down his spine. The threat was too obvious. But as he looked at Evelyn, he realized that his fear could not outweigh his responsibility. The corrupt were afraid, and that was why they had to keep fighting. "They're afraid," he said, "more for himself than for her. They know they're losing control, and they're desperate." Evelyn placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The next day, Reginald and Brian met with city officials and community leaders to discuss how to move forward. There was palpable tension in the room, especially among those who had been complicit or turned a blind eye to the corruption. But the presence of community leaders and residents, people who had been directly affected by prime builders, added a powerful voice to the conversation. "We're not here to just furlough a few people," one community leader said, her voice steady but powerful. "We want to commit to real change, retraining officers, a task force to review enforcement practices, and full transparency moving forward." Reginald stood, addressing both the officers and his fellow residents. What happened in our community was a betrayal of trust. This isn't just about a few corrupt individuals, it's about a culture that allowed this to happen. We need to rebuild from the ground up. The meeting was tense but productive. Those in power were being forced to listen. But Reginald knew the real fight was just beginning. City officials agreed to create a task force to monitor police practices and investigate allegations of bias. Reginald and Brian had won, but it came with a clear understanding: they had made powerful enemies who would not simply disappear. In the weeks that followed, Reginald and Brian found their lives changing. They were hailed as heroes by many, though threats continued. Reginald's home was vandalized one night, a reminder that not everyone appreciated his stance. But every time he considered backing down, he thought of the families he had seen outside City Hall, people who now saw him as a symbol of justice. One afternoon as he sat on his porch, he got a call from Brian. "Reg, it's Brian." His voice was softer than usual. "I just want to say thank you. We've done something important here." Reginald smiled, feeling a rare sense of peace. "This is bigger than us, Brian, and it's far from over. But maybe, just maybe, we've started something that can't be undone." Together, they had faced down a system designed to protect the powerful, and they had prevailed. They had inspired a community to rise up, and in doing so, they had reminded the world that justice could still be found, even in its darkest corners. As he ended the call, Reginald looked out at the neighborhood he'd fought so hard to protect. He knew there was still much work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope, the belief that change was not only possible, but already underway. The night wind blew gently, carrying with it the sounds of the city, of people finding their voices again. Reginald took a deep breath, feeling the breath of a future he once thought impossible. Tomorrow might bring new challenges, but tonight, at least tonight, he allowed himself to believe that a better tomorrow was coming.